Welcome back to Undulations. First thing, I really hope that everybody is doing okay. My state is under a stay-at-home order, so the home studio that you've seen on this channel has started to become a little bit like a spaceship. About 10 days ago, the refrigerator decided to stop working, so didn't want to get it repaired. Got a smaller refrigerator and have started using this one as storage. Now, I bring something like that up just as a way to say that these are unpredictable times, but I intend to keep uploading on the channel and I hope you guys get a chance to watch. I have been doing a fairly long tutorial, 45 minutes to an hour, and then in the following week posted a shorter ambient music piece. I've decided that what I really want to do is try to get a topic done, and where that I do it every week to just stay on a topic and have that complete, and then do a ambient piece in between topics. I think that will be good. So today we're gonna stick with the model cycles, and I feel like that I want to take a look at the effects on this device. So let's go ahead and dive in. All right, so I've decided to talk about the reverb first because it's kind of the easiest one to describe. The manual has a architecture diagram for the model cycles, and the basic thing to get out of this is that you've got everything that makes sound, and then some of that gets tapped off into the reverb send. So then that goes to whatever does the reverb, some sort of reverb circuit, I guess it's digital in this case, and then that comes back into the reverb return. These mixers are just, this is the same block, they just didn't have room to make the whole thing. So it goes out by send, it comes back into the mixer by the return, and then that goes to the outputs. So this type of reverb is different than something like the slow reverb pedal or a bunch of other reverb pedals, and even some software reverbs where there is a mix control, and so that when you turn up the mix to a certain point, you start to just basically lose the dry signal. So I'll use this term dry signal as that's the initial, the original sound that's made, and then the reverb, it basically is going to get bigger the more that you turn up the send, and yet you still don't lose the dry signal in this case. You don't lose it, but you can, as we'll see, drown it out. So to start with, I've got a cleared pattern with the initialized sounds like this. And to just kind of make things a little bit more interesting, what I want to do is go into the presets. I've got a little folder for kits, and I'm going to load this kit 0 and load the entire folder. And this is a good point to say two things, which is that I feel like that at some point I want to do a video that's entirely on sort of the data management of the model cycles, projects, patterns, presets, that sort of thing, and also about hooking the device up to the computer. So we'll get to that eventually, but for now we're just going to use these sounds, and particularly the kick and this chord. Now, there's another thing that I wanted to bring up just at this point, which is that these are sounds that came with the model cycle. They're down within the factory folder. I've just grouped them and put them into a kit that I liked. And one really important point to make, for those of you that own a model samples, you're probably familiar with using the factory samples, and if you're anything like me, it's like, sure, it's cool to get a factory sample and they've got it set up. You know, is it playing forward? Is it reversed? Where does the sample start? Where does it end, or whatever? And yet it all fundamentally comes down to the actual sample. And so that's just something that somebody else did. And it's hard to really like go from there in a sort of a creative sense. You can tweak it, but you really probably start finding your own samples, and so that sort of makes the instrument your own. But in the model cycles case, I feel like that with the factory presets, which you get to just by burrowing down into that folder, you've got all of that, and you can just dig in there, load them up, and it's so much more exposed than in the case of using a sampler, because it's like you can basically reverse engineer and figure out how they're making the sound that they're making. And so I feel like that the factory presets are a great resource for trying to learn more about sound design on the model cycles. I know I'm going to say it wrong at some point, model cycles. So let's just bear that in mind, that any of these sounds that you like, you can basically just find them on your own and dig into them and see what settings are what and how the sounds were made. So it's a very different, sort of more self-contained device. Okay, so the reverb parameters, basically there's the send that right now, for this kick, I have no send on it. I can start to turn the send up and you'll hear it. And as I turn it up even higher, this is full send. And it's a little bit hard to tell. We'll get a very clear example of this by the end of looking at the reverb as to the dry signal versus the actual wet reverb signal. But I can still kind of hear that initial thump. And then if I back it off, you can hear it even more clearly. And then the reverb size. So this is sort of meant to be like a room size. It can be very tight, like even down at 1. I thought it would basically just disappear there, but they realized that's not really a desirable setting to just get rid of it. You can do that with the send, so why not have it be a very tight reverb. And we'll get to the reverb tone setting in just a second, but I want to point out that the decay and the room size, reverb size, they sort of have a strong interplay. And by that I mean that you can have a decay that lasts longer than the reverb. So if you hear that, it's got that initial... All right, I'm clipping on the... I need to turn this down a little bit. Hopefully that hadn't been happening much. All right, so I can hear that room and then the decay after it. And while we normally think of reverb as something that lasts longer than the sound, with the decay set longer, you can have a reverb that occurs within the sound, and so it becomes more of a feature of the sound design than what we typically think of as a reverb effect. And some of the sounds that come with the model cycles, I think, are made with that sort of method. And so it's kind of cool. And you can even try and sort of get the reverb and the decay to be roughly the same timing, where they fade out together. So that's nice. I'll play over here on the chord. It's a little harder to hear with that. Let me turn that decay all the way down. So now I'm basically just gating it. Not hearing it. Well, I'm not hearing it because I'm not sending it. So, I'll send it all the way. And then with the decay way up, you can get something that has a nice long sound. So next, I really want to talk about the reverb tone, and I think probably the best way to do that is pick something that's sort of long but not too long, maybe like 90. Now, I don't want to gloss over the fact that while each of the tracks has its own reverb send amount, so you can choose whether a track has reverb or not, and you can even vary that send amount with a low frequency oscillator. I'll show you that by the end of this. But you've only got one reverb size and reverb tone that you can set that applies to all of the different tracks. Okay, so you access the reverb tone by pressing function, and I'm going to turn it all the way down. So this is going negative, so negative 64. That is going to be where it only picks up low frequencies. So what you'll notice, I've got the reverb all the way sending, so the send is all the way up, but there's really not much of a tone. And this is a great point to just really emphasize. If there's one takeaway from all of this, it's that all of the different parameters of send and size and tone, they interact with the sound parameters. And I feel like that decay mainly interacts with the reverb size, but that reverb tone mainly interacts with the pitch and the type of sound that you're making. What's going on here is that I've got the tone too low, and so it's like basically it's sort of a filter, maybe kind of a bandpass filter, where the signal coming from your initial sound needs to have something at that frequency to actually create a reverb tone or a reverb tail, if that makes sense. So I'll just demonstrate that right now the tone is too low, so there's no reverb. But as I increase the tone, you certainly start to get it. And it can go the other way, where here's at the middle, it's going to pick up basically a lot. But if I go too high, it starts to barely have anything go through that sort of tone window. But you can change the pitch. This was down at 1 octave below the 0, so if I go up to right at 0, or I'm going to push function to stay on the grid, I'll go an octave high. So you can hear a lot more of the reverb tail there because I have raised the pitch for that high tone, but you just have to keep track of how they interact. If I go low, then it won't basically excite the reverb tail. Well, I'm wrong there, a little bit further probably. Yeah, so it starts to dry it out basically. Versus this. And then, of course, the room size matters a lot too. All right, so I'm going to turn this back down to -12. And we'll just hear how it sounds very low with that long decay. So you might have to have headphones on to really appreciate that. That's like a pretty cool, dramatic sound. Now, the last thing about the reverb, and it's super important, has to do with panning. So if you look here at the architecture, you've got your sound generation, and that comes into the pan and divides into left and right. And so you get a send for the left and a send for the right, and then the audio signals continue on as left and right, but then the reverb comes back as left and right also before heading to the output. But the thing we have to look out for is that it's not necessarily just a sort of left reverb channel where it comes along this side, comes out the send, and then comes back on one side and then goes out, and so that everything stays on its own side. As we're going to see in just a second, it is really the opposite of that, where the reverb tends to mix things up. All right, so that if you have a signal panned to the left, then you'll hear the dry on the left side, but then you'll hear the wet, you'll hear the reverb tail on both sides. And this actually makes sense from a sort of a real acoustics standpoint. Think about really being in a room or in a concert hall, and if there is something where the sound source is coming from one side, you hear it coming from over there, but you also hear reflections of that sound coming from the opposite side. And so what we're going to do is take this kick drum, and I am going to hold function down and pan it all the way to the left. Now I'm going to turn up the room size to almost infinite and hit it again. And I have my headphones so I can hear it on both sides. I can hear that reverb decay on both sides. If you have headphones, you will too. But what I want to do for those of you that are watching it on a phone, I'm going to pull out the left side. Now, when I hit this, we're not going to hear the dry part. So that is just pure reverb. And just because you're only picking it up on one channel, you could, after the fact, in some audio software, double it onto both sides if you wanted to use this sound. Now, you can also do it with any of the other sounds. So let me try over here with this one. I'm going to go to track 6 and pan it all the way to the left. And we'll just hear what that sounds like. And so these are basically timbral changes. Sort of, it keeps the right frequency, but the harmonics that are included get changed by the reverb tone. Okay, I've fiddled around with this for a second, and this is sort of a cool thing. I mean, I don't know that there's expressly a pure noise source on the model cycles, but this thing where that I've got a very short envelope. I don't know why I'm pushing function. So very short envelope on the chord, probably works for any of them. That is just enough to stimulate the reverb, and then it doesn't have a whole lot of tonal information, so it basically becomes noisy. Yeah, so I feel like staying kind of within plus or minus 20 on the reverb is a way to keep most of your volume. Okay, so now I want to talk about distortion and also punch. And the place to start again on that is with the architecture, where if you look at this, it's got a blob here that is the FM machine engine. And then that comes out to go to the overdrive, which I believe to be the place where the distortion is made. And then that goes out through the other stuff. But the main thing to think about is that you've got sort of a starting voice here and then overdrive or distortion applied to that. And so I want to talk about that and then how that interacts with punch and some of the other details. And I think it's going to be easiest just to sort of spit this all out at once, that there are a lot of factors that go into the final volume of a sound on the model cycles. And so it basically starts with the velocity, and this is something that can be per trig, so per step in a sequence, or it can be how hard you hit the pad if you have velocity sensitivity set up, but there is no LFO control over velocity. Then there's punch, and this is as we talked about in the last video, a way to add a different type or different source of distortion to a sound, and it also does a type of compression, what the manual refers to as a pseudo compression. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Then that can be parameter locked or controlled by the low frequency oscillator. And then the next thing we've got is the level of a track. So we can change that just with this main knob over here. And the important thing to know about that is that it is a per track thing. It's not carried along with a preset. So that if you have a track set low and pull in a different preset, either manually or by preset locking, it will stay low. But really want to emphasize this, panning, it sort of looks like it would be similar because it's right there and it's actuated by the same knob, but that is actually carried along with the preset. And so if you have something that is saved such that it is panned to, say, the left, it will come back out that way, and that's useful. But then you also need to remember that if you are working with a preset, if you call up a preset that is perfectly balanced, it will override the setting that you just put on the pan. So bear that in mind. Then there is the volume and distortion. So on something like this, that is just a volume at 60 and below. But then once you start to get over 60, it starts to introduce distortion. And this is a per preset thing, and it's also parameter lockable and controllable by the LFO. And so you've got all of these different things that can be, some control one way, some control the other way, and it's a lot to keep track of. They all end up funneling into the master volume. And I have to say that this turns out to be an important sort of chain to keep track of, because if you want soft, distorted sounds, then you're going to have to do that by, at the very end, turning it down with the master volume. So it's very hard on this device to have a low, distorted sound and a clean sound that is actually louder. So to clarify all of this, I'm going to use a sequence again, and let me go to the kick drum, put in a fast set of hits, and we'll listen to that. Now, if I hit the chord, I'm going to run the decay out on that quite a bit. Okay, there's no interaction. If I want that louder, and it kind of even sounds like there's a little bit of distortion going there, but it might just be an illusion. Okay, next thing I'm going to do is add in punch on the drum. And you can definitely hear that punch introduces higher harmonics, sort of changes the timbre in the tail of that kick drum. So with it, without it, with it. All right, but what I want to do at this point is start to introduce the distortion. I'm going to turn the master volume down. So this is maxed in terms of having punch on, volume and distortion all the way up, and then now I'm going to play this again and add the distortion on that. So turn up the volume on the chord. And the thing to take away there is that that chord sound is getting basically distorted by the total volume. So it's not like side chaining or anything proper like that, but it sort of pushes it against the threshold of the system, and so you'll hear the kick drum in the decay of the chord. And then what I'm going to do is go back and parameter lock the velocity on some of these to be low. So you can hear the difference. 25. Okay, so the first half of these are going to be soft, and then when I do this chord hit, you can hear a big difference between when the volume is not being pressed against the top and when it is. So you might want that in something that you're doing, you might not want it, but I just sort of present it here as something to keep track of. I'm going to go ahead and turn the gate on so I can just hold it down. So now, after demonstrating that, I want to repeat what I said at the very beginning, which is that the master volume is just a thing that controls the volume sort of last thing as it goes out the door, but a lot of these other things interact. And so I changed the velocity, and that made it drop down low enough in volume to where it didn't sort of like top out. And then you could also do that with the track level. And so it's quite a few things to keep track of. And then ultimately, if you want to use a loud, clean signal from the model cycles with a distorted low signal, you're probably going to have to do that by taking the tracks into a DAW or something like that and change the relative volumes. So the last thing is, I was just curious about what some of these things like the distortion and the punch look like on the actual waveform of the sounds. And so I took some stuff into Audacity, and I'll just sort of narrate some pictures at this point. The first thing is what distortion looks like. And you can go from a clean wave shape like this to a distorted wave shape, and it just is really introducing sort of a jaggedness, and that's what gives the distorted sound. Anytime you have something that is a non-pure sinusoidal shape, you're introducing harmonics into the sound. And so that's what the distorted waves actually look like on the model cycles. And then the other thing is the punch. It also claims to be a compression or pseudo compression, which I guess may mean that it's done digitally and maybe not quite in the way of a normal compression. But the end result is that, okay, just based on the name, you can realize that the soft sounds are made a little bit louder, and the louder sounds are made softer, so it just sort of squeezes the mix and makes it basically easier to hear, easier to set the level correctly. But then another thing that compression does is that it has a sort of reaction time, and so loud sounds can actually get through the compression before it reacts, and that's what makes things like punch more punchy. And so an example of that just in pictures is a kick drum with no punch, and it's just got a fairly typical onset there, but then when you add the punch, it looks like this, where there's a much sharper peak right at the very beginning, and that's just sort of a relatively sharper peak, and it makes a big difference in the sound. So, all right, I think that's going to be enough for this video. Okay, so that's it for the reverb and distortion on the model cycles. I feel like there's some very interesting effects that you can do a lot of different things with. To keep this video even moderately short, no time for the delay today. Probably do the entire next video about the delay, because there are many things that you can do with that particular effect. So I appreciate everybody watching, and I will see you for that in the next video. And everybody, please do take care.